Hello, this is Mark Lieberman, the host of The World According to Mark, brought to you through the studios of WPVM FM in Asheville, North Carolina, and streaming on WPVMFM.org. Our guest today is Stephanie Monson Dahl, who is the Urban Design and Place Strategies Manager, which is quite a mouthful for me to say. But let me welcome Stephanie to the show.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad to be here today.
So I didn't know very much about you or your department until I read an article in the Citizen Times talking about the urban trail, which I would like you to talk about at some point. But as I learned more about you, I realized that you wear many hats and you do a lot of things involving design, involving strategies. And we were chatting before the show started about how all this sort of plays into the development of Asheville and challenges in trying to balance the various interests of lots of parties. It seems like everybody has an opinion about what they want Asheville to be, what they want it to look like, and what priorities they have in terms of the further development. But the one thing that we know, which is presumably a good thing, it seems like a good thing, is that a lot of people really like Asheville, and there's a lot more people that are coming in to visit and to retire, to stay, to start new businesses. And the opposite of that would be a bad thing. So it seems like it's a good thing. So let's start out with that, but let's talk about what you do, Stephanie, and in terms of having to deal with the competing strategies, and how do you contribute, and how does your department contribute to the culture and the art and the design of the city?
Okay. First, let me say that your statement about people coming here is not something to be lightly skipped over. We have grown quite a bit, and by 2040, we'll have another 40,000 people from what we were looking at last year that are be living in Buncombe County. So one of the questions that my department and really the whole organization of the city of Asheville thinks about every day, we wake up every day and we think about several things. One of them is, how are we going to serve not only all of the people that are here right now, but those extra people? Because even though they're spread throughout Buncombe County, many of them come into work or recreate or other types of activities in Asheville itself. So we have to figure that out. And you're right in saying that there can be some tensions, right? People have different values. They play out in different ways. We try to find commonalities through a lot of different planning processes. But we talked briefly about the Charlotte Street project, right? And that's a good one to talk about. So two competing values, and there are many there, or at least on the face of it, is preservation versus additional walkable neighborhoods. And so in the case of this area, the sidewalks are incredibly constrained from the topography in the way that there is a historic wall that separates those houses from the sidewalk and the street. The city went out and did a pretty darn good job, I would say, with community, with the road diet there a couple of years ago. But one of the things we continually heard about is that the sidewalks still aren't wide enough, and they never will be unless that area is transformed. At the same time, people love the way Charlotte Street feels in certain section. It has a historic allure, especially in the neighborhoods that are actually behind the Charlotte Street commercial corridor, Albemarle Park, or the Manor, which fronts right on Charlotte up there. And to be able to redevelop that site means that you would lose some of that character. So we specialize in holding, some would say bureaucratic, I would say democratic processes, being transparent and trying to make sure that anyone in the city of Asheville can participate in the process for making decisions about the world that they live in. That's really what we're getting at here.
Well, let me pause for a second and speak to that issue. Again, you use the term a democratic process. Democracy has an interesting tone these days. We're seeing democracy and anti-democracy themes being played out on the national stage when it comes to things like elections. But just focusing it in terms of the planning and development for Asheville, I guess one thing democracy means is people who have an interest in potential development or maintaining a certain quality or vibe, as people will say, of the city, they get to express themselves when there are decisions that are being made about building a condominium or tearing down an existing building or widening a street or improving a sidewalk or creating a park space. But I think where some of the tension seems to lie in terms of people getting mad about things, because usually when there's development going on, there seems to be a contingent of people that are mad about what's happening. And it seems like they're mad about it because they feel like they ought to be able to control the outcome. And the way they, and just speaking about it never seems to be quite enough. They want their voices to be heard by city government or county government or the planning department or whoever is involved, and they want the outcome to turn on what they have to say. That's not really the democracy that you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely not, right? That's, we don't elect leaders, so they tell us what to do. We don't want our neighbors to tell us what to do either. It's about equality and equity and access. That the democracy I'm talking about includes things like neighbors who are concerned about the loss of those houses being able to go out and use public space. And I'm a public space warrior, as are many people I work with, to demonstrate and have a performance. It's basically performance art, getting down to that, public art piece, to show their deep concern with the loss of those homes, right? And that they aren't being told that they can't, by the police, that they can't do that in those spaces. And it also looks like having frankly a pretty long development review process in which at every step of the way, citizens, and I hate using that word, but members of the public, residents, workers, anyone really can come out and speak, and all voices are considered. And one of the things as an urban planner that we have to be thoughtful of is that our actual AICP code of ethics says that we will represent the voices of the people that aren't heard. So that's part of democracy too, is realizing that just because, you've got some squeaky wheels going on, or people who have the time, like we all know this, and right, but there's people who have more time and access than others. They have relationships with people in the city government. I bet there's a bunch of people listening right now that don't know anyone that works for the city government. And at the same time, there are 50 people in Asheville who know 20 folks, and they call them on a weekly basis. And so we have to make sure that that doesn't upset the apple cart, basically. We have to balance that.
Meaning that we don't necessarily want the squeaky wheel to get all of the oil, that the people
Exactly.
that have leverage and contacts, they'll get their opinions heard, and they'll organize. There are a lot of people who may, if polled, have feelings about, and let's just take Charlotte Street again as the example, have thoughts about it, but they're too busy, or they're not sufficiently educated about what's actually going on to participate. But
Or
they still matter.
they still matter, or they've been ignored or disappointed, right? We got to make sure we put that in too. It's like many times people, they might know how to access governmental services, but they're not interested in any way, shape, or form in doing that because they've been, just being honest, that's at the federal, state, local, county level. They've just been disappointed, and they feel like they weren't heard once, or they weren't heard 3 times, so they're not going to be heard again. And those voices matter too.
So talking a little bit more specifically about what you do on a daily basis that doesn't necessarily involve um, the challenges and the the loud voices that we want this, we don't want that. What is it that you do? What does your team do, and how do you function with the rest of the group, so to speak, that are involved in planning at the city in the city of Asheville?
So our division is fairly new, and it's been evolving over the course of a couple of years. And I'll say that it started when I was leading a team of folks that spent about a decade working deeply in and around the River Arts District to develop relationships and develop trust, and to look at the needs of the specific communities that were engaged there and some that weren't at the time. So, and I'll give you an example for that as recreation users who had no access to the riverfront at the time, and really think about place and how place performs, our public space in particular. In the River Arts District, we had acres of city-owned property and 2 miles of city-maintained roadway, where we could figure out, like, how does that public space really serve our community? At the time, it was just unsafe and not doing a whole heck of a lot. So getting to what our division does is we now look across our community in different neighborhoods, but especially in mixed use districts like West Asheville and the South Slope downtown, what have you, and think about public space and how it really can serve communities. So examples of some of the work that we've done is, we create master plans for public places. So the Haywood and Page project, lovingly known by many as the Pit, that is something that our division took on and co-created with the community. And that resolved, talking about values and tensions, that resolved many years of tensions about what should happen with that property. It's not over, but that is there. Our team spearheaded a program called Asheville Shared Space, which was our response to the pandemic, saying everyone's going to have to operate differently during this time. We need to share our public spaces with people, especially our businesses, to make sure that our economy stays resilient. And so within that program, we allowed folks, the first thing we did was put up curbside loading spots all over town so that restaurants could do takeout or retail could do takeaway, pickup stuff. And we looked at, we created some shared streets. The first one we did was actually on the block downtown, the historically African-American neighborhood, and worked with them first, worked in the South Slope and other neighborhoods to do some parklets and expand outdoor dining, things like that. So that's an example of something our division does. And we do some nitty gritty work, like looking at things, details people never think about, like sidewalk standards. How wide should a sidewalk be in a specific place? Should the grass strip be on the street side, or how are our trees going to be placed? And what is the tension between people wanting trees, but also wanting to be able to walk, because trees take up a great deal of space in our small sidewalk areas. So we do stuff like that. We do a lot of planning for city-owned properties and work with our real estate team in community and economic development to look at that. And we work across departments on a variety of things. The public art piece that you brought up is also in our wheelhouse.
So let's, if you will, talk a little bit more about the River Arts District, because you mentioned that the city had made a big investment there. As I understand it, and I may not understand it, so you'll correct me, the so-called River Arts District, at one time in the area's evolution, was a place of sort of small industrial type buildings devoted to, maybe it was textiles. I can't tell from what's still left there, but a lot of buildings, single story buildings. And so I'm imagining that as those businesses left, or stopped employing people, there were just a bunch of buildings there. People took advantage of that and used their amateur art to draw graffiti. You said it mentioned it was unsafe, so I'm guessing that with as the commercial aspects and the industrial aspects departed, there wasn't a lot of reason for people to go down there except possibly to make mischief. And somehow, I guess, there must have been somebody's idea or a lot of somebody's that said, we can
A lot.
reclaim this. We can do something with this. There's a river. River usually means that that's something that can be reclaimed for its natural, artistic, and outdoor value. And here's what we think could be done. But that had to also tie into what developers and what businesses might be willing to contribute to make it an area that people now want to go to, but is still in a stage of continual development. Is that sort of a fair
Yeah,
synopsis?
a lot of that is really spot on. I would want to underscore that the River Arts District was always cool, and as much as it's true that it was unsafe, lots of people pioneered and hung out there and Porge Buck and the McCarthys, they were there long before we did any improvements to the area. But you're right in the sense that there were a lot of abandoned warehouse buildings. There are many, many more than you see today. A huge fire at the old cotton mill warehouse site in the early 90s destroyed much of the kind of extent historical character that you would be amazed at what was there. But yes, the the proximity of the river is a big selling point. But for the artist, it was the clear span warehouses that have large loading docks, so people like John Payne could bring in a ton of metal and do his sculpture work, and nobody was going to bother them down there. Many of the artists, including Patty Turner, who's one of the founders of the River Arts District, were originally in downtown Asheville. So when we were discussing how downtown Asheville during the 70s felt a little abandoned, and people have these, stories about being able to shoot a shotgun down the middle of the street. Same thing. Artists, were able to take over their spaces. They're a lot less risk averse, and they were doing the work in downtown. And then many of those folks ended up in the river or Marshall, places like Marshall, North Carolina. So the thing I'd say is we had over 100 artists in the River Arts District to kind of, not kind of, to partner with right from the get-go. There weren't a lot of other commercial businesses down there. There were some. There's still some that have been there for a long time, like Asheville Waste Paper, just like an institution. But those folks told us what they wanted. And I think that that's really important to point out, is that the city didn't come up with a grand scheme. There was a plan, the Wilma Dykeman Riverway Master Plan, that was created and adopted by the city and county and others. Riverlink commissioned the plan. And that plan was done in 2004, a year of a huge flood here, huge flood that changed a lot of things for our community. But that was also done with a ton of community input, and it's a very, very high level concept. It just basically said, make things connected, make it healthier, support the artists, figure out a way where you can be, sustainability should be able to be compatible with economic development, figure that out. So we had that blueprint. And then those artists and some of those core institution businesses were able to tell us what their issues were. I mean, there's stuff people don't realize. Like, we spent 2 years just working on a brownfields remediation program before any of this happened. We met with all of those property owners and spent like EPA grant dollars, almost $2 million, helping clean up the area. And it's one of the ways that we eventually attracted New Belgium, because they heard about it. And we're able to say, we would like to be involved in something like that. And we're looking for an East Coast brewery. We want to help clean something up. And they did.
That's interesting. Let me just reintroduce you to those just tuning in. That was Stephanie Monson Dahl, who is the Urban Design and Place Strategy Manager, which I still having a hard time getting out. And we're talking about the city of Asheville, Buncombe County, the general area, and trying to manage development needs and manage preservation and balance a lot of different interests. And what you're describing in that last discussion was um, many people may just think that city council or the planning commission moves on a dime and develops a strategy without a lot of research, without a lot of study, and without a lot of listening. But that's really the opposite, is what you're saying, of what they do. That there are strategies, there are master plans, there's presumably changes from master plans, because a plan is just still a plan,
Right.
and things happen, like, a flood happens. So it turns out.
That was huge. That was huge. Or new people move here. You have new businesses that come in, and certainly in the River Arts District, when we first started down there were maybe 3 restaurants, not one place that served dinner. And now there are, I think, over 15, and 9 of them serve dinner. And so it's important as a planner, anyone who's doing community development or anything like that, to be fresh, and to realize that you have to respect both the folks that have been there for a long time and their needs, and the people that are coming in.
Well, your discussion a moment ago about the brewery that wanted to participate, what was the name of it?
New Belgium.
New Belgium. I remember practically the first week or two that I moved to Asheville, and I discovered the River Arts District, and walked into a studio and said, "Oh, this is really cool that they've repurposed these buildings, and these people are blowing glass, and they're doing all this stuff." And someone commented that, well, this wasn't going to last very long, because the price of real estate is going up, and it's all because of those breweries that are coming in that are escalating the cost of land, their very presence. But of course, again, as we said before we got on the air, that's only one side of the story. The fact that you can have companies like breweries, which have to be mindful of their consumers, they have to be sensitive to consumer issues and citizen issues and preservations. Yes, if they come in and buy land, that obviously is going to have an impact on the value of land everywhere. The land is going to be much more valuable after commercialization than before commercialization. But that's the question. Do you want River Arts District to just be these abandoned buildings, or do you want it to be a mixture of diverse businesses and diverse ways of connecting with the community?
Yeah. I've been hearing the River Arts District is over for 10 years, right? So it just depends on who you talk to and when they were there. And people say that about every arts district or every revitalized, people say that about downtown, but there's always something new and exciting there for people. And what I'd say is that there are more artists in the River Arts District now than ever. There are maybe 150 more artists down there than there were 10 years ago. And probably 4 more buildings have been renovated. And many of the buildings are actually owned by artists, which is really key, is who is owning those places. There is a problem with gentrification. I'm not trying to say that there isn't. There is a problem, and people do get priced out. And people will, the one thing I can say that's a positive to that is people will populate other areas and seed art and culture and creative commerce in new zones. So whether or not I would say whether or not, it's not a question of whether or not the River Arts District is, going to last. It's like, what will it be in 20 years? Something that everybody should be thinking about is how little residential there is in and around this area. And we've had several development proposals that have not come to fruition in the past 5 years. Radloff's is one, the Stone Yard is one. They may still be on the table, who knows? And these are mixed use, or one of them's residential, but places with hundreds of new residential units where people could live and make this a 24/7 atmosphere. We have one on the table right now on Riverlink's property, right there on Riverside Drive, I think at 159 Riverside Drive. And that will change the area again, and hopefully in a really positive way. You want residents to be in areas like this. It actually helps um, mitigate the feelings that it has become like solely a commercial area or only for tourists or something like that, which is just some of the complaints I heard. And the last thing I'll say about it, though, is I have never seen a more diverse set of locals in the River Arts District that I have in the last year. And that is 100% because of the creation of 9 acres of new open space with those 2 wetlands and the 2 miles of greenway and the separated bike lane. People that live here, they might not be going and buying the art all the time, although I think they are. They're visiting the area and they're making it a different place. They're making it a place that is more for locals now, which is awesome, right?
Well, you use the word gentrification, and I've experienced the changing meaning of that, but it still seems like many people, when they use the term gentrification, it's always with the bad connotations.
Mhm.
Gentrification means moving out those people or businesses that were there and replacing them with, I guess gentrification means more refined. It could also mean more bland, less interesting. But having come from Philadelphia and still keeping tabs on what's going on in the areas around the city of Philadelphia, there are areas with names like Fishtown and Kensington and whatever that were places that nobody ever would come unless they came packing, guns to protect themselves.
Mhm.
And now I don't know exactly what they look like, but there are businesses, there are young people, there are young professionals, there's young families moving into those areas. And then, of course, that means there's restaurants and there's bars and there's attractions. Well, gentrification can be handled badly when all you do is move people out to wherever,
Mhm.
and you put up a bunch of, not very terribly interesting, not very attractive, not very walkable places. But gentrification can also mean making a place better, more attractive, so that people want to visit it, so that people want to participate, I guess. That's my thoughts. I don't know how you feel about it.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, to be frank, I think I would be hesitant to say that there's a positive side of gentrification exactly for the reasons you said, which, right, is that it has a negative connotation. And that is the displacement of people, which is like it's very current and now. It's also something that's very right now. I think we're looking at our community and nationwide, like a urban renewal and other serial forced removal efforts that generally white supremacy has injected into our system over and over again over history. It's just something that it feels like ugh. But yeah, there's some safety. What I'd say about the River Arts District for people who are like it wasn't unsafe, it's like, okay, I'm going to take you down to the River Arts District to talk to a couple of people who have been there for 30 or more years. When I first started working there, which is not that long ago, it was a place where people were dying. They were dying because there were no eyes on the street and because there were so many places to go where you could just be unseen for a long time. Um, and nobody was going to care for you, that was how you ended up. And there was a place, I think in there are two of these different places. There was one in Texas and one in California in San Francisco, but one of them was called the Ghost Ship. Do you remember this story?
No.
And it was one of these things like, oh, it's very cool. Like, and yes, I remember in my 20s going to many abandoned warehouse parties in Atlanta or where have you, where I wasn't quite sure if the electricity had actually been
Restored,
routed
turned
by
off.
like by an electrician or what have you. And I'm laughing, but the truth is people die in those places. There's no, in our case, in the River Arts District, there was a place where we had to tell the person who owned the building, you need to remove all of your artist tenants from these buildings It was painful for the city to do this. This was years ago. And the main reason was there was no, people were living there, and there was no fire sprinkler set up, fire suppression anywhere. There was no water on most of the sites. So even if the fire department was going to come, if something happened, and we're talking about people who are welding, using chemical solvents and all sorts of things. And so like there's the really crazy where I'm like, a little gentrification here might be good. Like you need to follow some rules, but we've got to, as a community, have a conversation about what's happening in Asheville. It's been happening for a long time, but the truth is that we all know it's out of control. The cost of living is out of control here, meaning that people who work here cannot afford to live here anymore.
Well, the cost of living is increased. All the statistics point to Asheville having a higher increase in cost of living than any other urban area in the state of North Carolina, save one. The name of that town escapes me. One of the main features or factors in terms of the increased cost of living is housing.
Mhm.
And you mentioned affordable housing a moment ago. Maybe that's another word that we could talk about more than trying to rehabilitate the word gentrification, which substituted for urban renewal back in the 50s and 60s. But the main word in affordable housing is housing. And so if
I thought you were going to say the main word was affordable.
no, I think
It's housing. Okay.
I think it's
housing.
housing, which
Okay.
is
Yeah,
to
it's
say
true.
that if you don't have enough housing, then it's not going to be affordable. Just, that's the idea. Yes, there's some housing that's specifically developed for people who already have a lot of money, but if there is a shortage of housing that's proximate to jobs and proximate to jobs in the city of Asheville, then there's not going to be any place for people who are in the middle income or lower middle income or whatever strata. They're not going to be able to afford it. But if you don't plan for some degree of housing development, the situation doesn't improve. It gets worse, I would think. So again, I bring this up and then not to be polemic, but I think affordable housing seems to come up a lot in terms of these new developments that are planned for or on the books or in front of the council or for the Buncombe County Commissioners or the Planning Commission. Is there a what is that about? I mean, I've had other guests on the show trying to explain to me what do we mean by having an an affordable housing initiative? Is that something you can speak to?
I can speak a little bit. I work I work with a team of people at the city. I'm not the lead, but I work on a lot of initiatives to support the creation of affordable housing. And it's just as simple as, there's a mathematical formula where you can take a look. There's data out there that says, here's 92,000 people that live in Asheville, or 200 and blah, blah, blah people that live in 1,000 people live in Buncombe County. What are they making? What is their income? How much is rent? How much is it to buy a house? How many houses are there? And how many households are there? And you do the math, and you can see that there's an affordable housing crisis. For the city, what the initiative looks like is, what is our role? Like how can the city make some kind of impact in a market that is primarily a private market, right? This is, develop the world of developers and what have you. And the city is not a developer. We do not directly develop housing. Whereas some institutions like the Housing Authority of the city of Asheville, they may directly create affordable housing, and they create deeply affordable housing generally, or a mix of housing types. So in our case, we looked to the voters to approve an affordable housing bond that was used to create plans to look at city-owned property that would be suitable. We called them high impact sites, and these are sites that would be close to our downtown area, which is, downtown, if you want to think of it as a company, it's our major employer, right? The other major employers being Mission and the school system and the county and what have you. But downtown employs a lot of people. And so we're looking at that. We're looking at being able to have money to actually subsidize private developers to create affordable housing. I'll say that I've had my world turned upside down in the last couple of years, being a part of looking at the math, the pro formas that goes into developing sites, even sites that we would be giving away technically for free in exchange for folks providing affordable housing in alignment with what the community wants to see. So, the community wants to see a lot of interesting, things that are important. We don't just create affordable housing, but it's really hard. So that's, I think the takeaway that I would like to say, I'm not answering your question, but I'll tell you the message I want to say is it is a lot harder than anyone thinks. And certainly is harder than I walked into it thinking. It's expensive as heck, and it requires a ton of time to put those deals together. And are getting back to our conversation about values, like we can look at Charlotte Street again, values of preservation or walkability. Well, there's also the value of being able to house our community. And so people are going to say, no, that's not true, Stephanie, or whatever. But in some sense, when you say we want to preserve these 12 or however many homes in the area that we feel give our community the character that makes it special, you're also saying, and we don't, on this site at least, want to have 150 new households close to downtown and close to their jobs, where they're not going to experience 45 minutes of commuter traffic every day and clog up everything for everybody else, increase greenhouse gas emissions, all that stuff. So it's nuanced. It's not as cut and dry as I just put it, but affordable housing or creating housing is obviously a problem here.
So it's a problem, and the question is, what part does the city play? What part does the county play? What part do the private developers play? Again, my guest is Stephanie Dahl, who is the Urban Design and Place Strategies Manager for the city of Asheville. There's a perception, and again, I may have missed something in the newspaper read of the Charlotte Street issue, but there seems to be a perception that the city has the ability to require, as part of a bargain, so to speak, with the developers, that the developers set aside some number of housing units, whether it's rentals or condos or whatever, as affordable, meaning the price of the rent or the price of the condo takes into account median level income or something like that, and that in return, a developer might ask for tax abatement or tax concessions to sort of make that deal. Are you familiar with that line of thinking?
Oh, this is a lot of conflation of different policies
Okay.
and rules that exist in the state. And I'll just say, in general, requiring developers to create affordable housing is illegal in North Carolina. There's maybe one community, I won't name their name, but that everyone in the planning world kind of knows gets away with of what we call inclusionary zoning in the planning world. So inclusionary zoning is when you require a developer to include affordable units in a specific zoning district, or net zoning district can be an overlay or what, jargon. So that's generally just not allowed. Now, because we listen to our community, have done a lot of things to try to make that happen anyway, because it's clear we have affordable housing issues here. And it's clear that people want to see something like that. So you saw with the adoption of the new hotel development regulations that there are nods to things like public art, but also affordable housing and other community, what I'll call community benefits or community needs. In general, there is a conditional zoning process that exists for any large project that's going to be coming through in Asheville, and the Charlotte Street is that type of project, where because of its size, the impacts of that are considered, and it can be approved only if certain conditions are met. So the way that the city of Asheville or city council has generally been able to include affordability in many of those development agreements is because they're all a larger size, and they realize that their impact that they're creating, there's got to be a nexus there between the what they're wanting to do and the impact of the community here, that they need to design their project in such a way and program their project, and that's what they're doing with affordable housing, to mitigate things. So affordable housing would be a way to mitigate and to make sure that we have an appropriate and healthy mix of different types of housing stock and price points in our community. It's a lot.
Well, let me see if you can enlighten myself and our listeners. The term conditional zoning. I'm used to thinking of zoning as it's either residential or it's commercial or it's industrial, or I've recently discovered in North Carolina, they have something called open use, which was a revelation and not a totally agreeable one, because it seemed like with open use, you can put
Is that like,
anything there.
yeah,
Except
like a pagoon or whatever?
but
Pig
you can't,
lagoon?
yeah,
Yeah.
and you can't put a nuclear reactor there, but that's probably all you can't do. But in any event, conditional zoning. So somebody wants to develop property for residential use in an area where residential use is permitted. Where does the conditional part
When
get?
it's large, when it's of a larger size of over a certain, usually it's like there'll be a certain amount of units depending in that area. So, and then the condition, it just means you've got your zoning that you were talking about, which is the typical, they call it Euclidean zoning, which is based on use and districts, and we separate things.
Right.
And conditional zoning is more concerned with the impact because of its size
So
of the
because of its
project.
size,
You have to get conditions
yeah,
put onto
and
the
that
approval.
and
That's the
that's
conditions.
exactly. And the $64,000 question is, who makes up those conditions? Where do,
City. So it is generally an agreement that's agreed on by council. What I'd say is council approves the conditions
subject to conditions? So it's a
that council
negotiation
approves.
process.
It basically is. And so the developer and throughout the process, by the way, it's not just a developer, but community volunteers who sit on the downtown commission or the planning and zoning commission, staff who sits on the technical review committee, people, comments that are collected during that time are used to help consider and craft those conditions.
So that was the Athenian democracy that you were talking about before.
A little bit.
Everybody gets to sit around where the drum circle is and make a contribution. But the conditions are part of the democratic process, which again means just because you have a point of view doesn't mean you get your way. It just means you get to articulate what your point of view is. So the way the affordable housing issue entered into the discussions for what gets done with this Charlotte Street development is that some people said, okay, if you're going to be able to build that, then you need to create some affordable housing. That was one topic, but then there are a multiplicity of other issues that work their way into the conditions. So it's not, again, just to dispel what people think, it's not that city council just sits there, takes in the information, but is so enamored with the potential new tax revenue that they just make the decision without consideration of all of these other issues with all these other entities. That's what I was trying to get across.
Yeah, and people need to remember, like, it's, tax revenue is, property tax revenue is the largest way the city gets revenue, and it is important in that sense. But when you build a new brewery or a 200-unit apartment complex, the calls for services and the infrastructure that needs to be put into those places, it costs money too. So it's not like the city is just receiving this additional tax revenue. It's going back out. Right. Those are services that are provided. So that I would like to dispel the myth that the city is some kind of greedy, looking for all the property tax revenue in the world. Like, we just really want to create great places that our community can live with for the next 50 years. That's what we're talking about again. Not just today, which is important.
So let's get back then to making the city a great place, and what is it that you're doing and can do, and the challenges that are ahead. And again, my guest is Stephanie Dahl, Urban Design and Place Strategies Manager for the City of Asheville. Got that out.
Yoo-hoo.
And let's go to this urban trail as an example of something. We talked already about the River Arts District, but what was the genesis of that, and what has become of that?
Mm. So the urban trail was this great idea that started in the 80s during revival, like what we would call the heart of downtown revitalization, between some folks like Leslie Anderson, who was running the downtown development office for the city at the time, and Grace Pless, who ended up chairing and organizing and coordinating and spearheading and leading the charge for the urban trail for many, many years. And just, again, the idea would be, how do we get people downtown? At the time, that was a problem, right? And how do we, this is important with public art, how do we celebrate our downtown? How do we educate people about our downtown? How do we build relationships with the artists that are emerging here, and start engaging them in our place, and seeing that there can be a dialogue between art and a specific location? So this was before we had a public art board or any kind of public art master plan or anything like this. Is the idea would be like, we could have a walking trail, history, art, let's whip it up. So that's kind of the genesis, was that there were a lot of great, cool ideas that people would not do in the same way today, because we're in a different Asheville than we were in 1982 or 5. Yeah.
Okay, and so what does it look like?
So it looks like when you're walking downtown, you're going to encounter pieces of art. Many of them are bronze statuary, and some of them are not, like the Elizabeth Blackwell MD station that's on College Street is a beautiful metal bench filled with different leaves and plants, because she was into herbs and that type of thing. And each one of these helps, with the plaque, tell a story about a little piece of Asheville's history. So it starts by the art museum. There's a plaque over there, but most people start at actually the second station, which is the Pigs and Turkeys, called Crossroads. It's right in front of the former Vance Monument. And it basically talks about how this is the center of our downtown. It was, that this is, what it doesn't say, and I want to get to this point. I'll tell you what it doesn't say, but first I'll say, it says that this is the crossroads. This is where Cherokee trading and hunting trails came through the area, and they were later used by settlers to do the same thing, driving hogs, driving turkeys, and this is where commerce in Asheville kind of began. And you have 30 stations all around downtown. It took like 30 years to get all of it done. And there's a great audio tour that goes along with it. We have printed maps and all of those things. But over the years, we've had vandalism. We've had pieces stolen. We've had pieces run into by cars. We've had issues, and what we're looking at now is issues with interpretation, and really taking a look now, years later, at how we told the story of Asheville and how we want to tell it moving forward. So the story that you read in the paper, what it's about is that we recently reinstalled or rehabilitated 3 different stations on the urban trail. And at one of them, which is Shopping Days on Haywood Street, we were able to put in a new plaque that honored the hundreds of Jewish merchants and their families that contributed so much to Asheville's history, philanthropy, healthcare, educational systems, and not to mention the kind of the feel and vibrancy of what we think of downtown, right? Because it wasn't always dead. It was dead just in that one, couple decades or what have you. And efforts like that are going to be increasing on the urban trail, where we are able to add in pieces that expand our knowledge. And while we're not looking to expand the trail necessarily with more markers, we are looking to make it more relevant to the people that are here now. Yeah. So can I tell you about a particular marker that
Sure.
has some, there is a marker that is on Biltmore Avenue on the corner of Eagle and Biltmore, and it is on a tall pole. It is a bronze eagle, and there is a plaque there that basically said, like, here stood the Eagle Hotel. And it was run by James Patton, and there were other hotels in the area, and this was kind of the legacy, or the precursor of Asheville as a tourism mecca, because it pretty much always has been a place for visitors as well as for locals. Well, what this story doesn't tell you, or what that little plaque doesn't tell you, is that the owner of that hotel was one of the largest enslavers of Black human beings in our community, and that all of the people that ran that hotel were Black. They were African Americans who lived in quarters that were on what we now call the block. And it was the historical starting of the block neighborhood and that historically African-American character. And so there's many pieces like that, which I think other people would see and they would think, well, this certainly at this time glosses over really a big part of our history. So that those are the types of things that the Public Art and Cultural Commission and city staff and Grace Plus, even someone who has been doing this for many, many years, are now looking at and going, how we can do better. We can do better.
That is a remarkable story, actually, it seems to me, in the context of a lot of what we're hearing nationally about, cancel culture and critical race theory and so on and so forth. In that, it sounds to me as if there's an attempt to not gloss over a lot of the more despicable aspects of slavery. And well, slavery in itself is despicable. You don't need to add an adjective to it, but behind every story of perhaps industrial or philanthropic success, there tends to be
Yeah.
another story that involves other folks, and the fact that this business was basically carried out by African Americans, and yet nobody really knows that story. The way you tell the story is what will survive and hopefully educate. And I guess that comes up for me, and maybe you don't want to comment about this because it's been a topic for such a long time, which is the former Vance Monument.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I again came to Asheville and looked at that thing, the main thing that I took away from it is that's pretty ugly looking. I don't really know what it is. It's tall. It's not colorful. It's not pretty. There's nothing uniquely architecturally interesting
It's
about it.
definitely not unique. The obelisk was a huge trend at that time for a good 20, 30 years, a symbol of power by far.
Right. So I think I possibly got that message. So in any event, the fact of the matter is it's down now.
Mhm.
There's still some issues, I guess, about how it
Yep.
was taken down and where the stone went and so on and so forth. And there's probably several task forces that are looking at what to do with it. Are you involved in any way in that discussion and those discussions? I assume you are.
I am. So I want to clarify that it has not been completely removed. Most people that are paying attention do know that. Like, you'll come to the heart of our downtown and you'll see this kind of giant black ugly tarp. Not a huge improvement there, marking the center of our downtown, but the monument is down, so that is arguably an improvement. Um, But so the time capsule that people have asked a lot about, those things are all still there because they're in the base of the monument, and any additional work is on hold pending some legal decisions. But that doesn't mean that we aren't still forward thinking about this. And so I can tell you what is going to happen. I am working with the city manager's office to release a request for qualifications and interest from folks that can do community engagement, project development, a ton of community engagement, by the way, project development, urban design, and urban planning around the future of that specific site. So let me back up for a minute here and say that what had been planned in the interim is that once that monument was completely removed, it would be landscaped. So there's a fence around it right now. It's been there forever, or a version of that fence has been there for forever. So in an interim period, we would have some landscaping in there. And while that's there, we would figure out what to do. I think everybody has great ideas. What I can say is that I've received a ton of, emails and pieces of advice and input, which is so cool. And what we want to do is really bring people together to have those conversations in a facilitated and organized manner where it is fun for people. It doesn't always have to be fun. Like some of this is, the truth telling piece of it is not always fun. But some of it is. Like there's no reason why we can't do things like they did in New Orleans with paper monuments and say, who are the people in your lives or that you've heard about that should have been memorialized? And let's work with artists to create cool wheat paste posters on them and put them up in different places around town so that different stories are being told than the ones that were here and that we're making people feel excluded. So there will be a process. What we're not doing, which is different, is we're not going out and asking someone to come, like a consultant to come in and to facilitate a very specific process that they've made up. What we're doing is we're asking people who are qualified to come work with community to figure out what that process looks like.
That's probably the opposite of how that monument was put up to begin with. And it does seem like it speaks again more to the democratization of it. And I think it's a great process, frankly, that you're going to, have a collective of different viewpoints. Doesn't mean that any one party is going to get their voice in it.
Nope.
And so we're not going to get a retelling of the Civil War or whatever. We're going to get something, and it's going to be interesting, and it's going to be diverse, and there's going to be people that love it and people that possibly don't.
That won't. There'll be, there's a lot of talk in on the national level, but also on the local level about monuments and memorials in general, and whether or not we even need them anymore. And certainly, do we even need them to memorialize specific people, right? As opposed to movements or a feeling. And that's really more about what public art is. And then the other piece of this I think will be important for our community is not only the Vance Monument that can sometimes make Pack Square feel exclusive to people.
Right.
So design in public space is really important. And what's important for a lot of people to remember is that the George Floyd murder resulted in protests all over the country, all over the world, honestly. But here, you remember that they really centered around our Pack Square Park. So right. That entire area is really important for us to think about for gathering as well.
Well, time has gotten away from us. I want to thank Steph, Monson, Dahl. I feel like we just got into it, and there's much more, so we're going to have you back. But thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure.
Terrific. We'll have you again.
Thanks.